The folder was already on the table when Charles entered the room. Plain gray, unmarked, turned to face the chair where he would sit. Two aides stood near the wall with their hands folded, and neither of them looked at the king as he crossed the carpet because both of them already knew what the folder held. Charles did not sit at once. He looked at the gray cover the way a man looks at a letter he has not yet decided to open. Then he pulled out the chair, lowered himself into it, and reached for the tape along one edge. He had survived scandal. He had outlasted quiet betrayal. He had spent a long life learning to keep his face still while the ground shifted beneath him. But when he lifted the cover and read the first line, the breath went out of him and did not come back for several seconds. The room waited. No one moved, because what lay inside that folder was not an administrative error, not a misfiled draft, not something a secretary would later apologize for. It was a plan. Assembled in silence, ordered by hand, annotated in a handwriting he had known for 30 years. And it had been built for the day he could no longer defend himself. Before we go any further into what those pages contained and who quietly built them, take a moment to subscribe so the rest of this story reaches you when it comes. What begins inside a marriage rarely ends there, but the folder only tells you what was found. To understand why it existed at all, we have to go back to a corridor in Windsor, to a pair of doors that closed at the wrong moment, in front of the wrong person, and were never spoken about again. At least, not until now. The folder was waiting for him in the dim light of the private study. It was a plain gray, the kind of object that looked like 1,000 other bureaucratic files circulating through the palace, but the air in the room told him this one was different. King Charles did not sit at once. He looked at the two men standing by the wall. They were senior staff, veterans of 1,000 crises, yet they would not meet his gaze. They looked instead at the polished floor, their hands clasped behind their backs in a silence that felt heavier than an accusation. He sat. He reached for the thin tape sealing the edge. The sound of it pulling away was the only noise in the room. When he lifted the cover, the first page was titled simply, Succession Planning. But this was not the plan he had authorized. The diagrams were different. The lines of authority were shifted. And there, in the narrow white margins, was the handwriting. It was a fluid, familiar script he had seen on birthday cards and grocery lists for over 30 years. It was Camilla's. Charles removed his glasses, folded them slowly, and laid them on the desk. He felt the breath leave him. This was not a draft for his review. This was a structure built in the shadows, a quiet rearrangement of the monarchy for a time when he would no longer be there to oversee it. His eyes moved to the page concerning the Prince of Wales. Beside William's name, the handwriting had left a specific instruction, hold until review. The heir to the throne, his own son, was being treated like a hazard to be managed, a piece of the board to be neutralized until the right moment. But the true shock lay deeper. Near the middle of the stack, he found a page dedicated to Prince George. It proposed a new, symbolic role for the child, a public appearance designed to anchor the transition. There was no record that William or Catherine had ever been consulted. There was no parental signature. There was only the plan, cold and complete, using a child as a shield for a transfer of power that had never been discussed. Charles sat motionless, his hand resting flat on the cover. He had survived scandals that nearly broke the crown, but those had come from the outside. This was coming from the pillow beside him. He understood now that he had found the shape of a betrayal, but he did not yet know how deep the roots went, or how many people outside this room were already holding their own copies. The folder had answers, but it didn't have a beginning, and that was the part Charles had not yet found. The summons for Prince William was brief and carried no explanation. He arrived at the private study to find his father standing by the window, the gray folder now sitting on the corner of the desk like a piece of unexploded ordnance. Charles did not offer a greeting. He simply gestured toward the chair and slid the file across the polished wood. William sat, his movements practiced and efficient, but his eyes never left his father's face. He began to read. When he reached the third page, he stopped. The text described the Prince of Wales not as a successor, but as a potential destabilizing figure whose earliest decisions ought to be shaped by a council of advisors chosen in advance. It painted a portrait of a man who could not be trusted with the full weight of the crown without a harness. William's hand closed around the top rail of the chair until his knuckles went white. He did not raise his voice. He asked in a tone that was very quiet and very level, Who approved this? The king did not answer. He turned away from the window, but he did not meet his son's eyes. He let the silence stretch across the room, and in that silence, the answer arrived. William understood it in the space where the words should have been. It reached inside his father's marriage and rearranged the future while he slept. Anger would have been a mercy compared to this. Anger passes, but what he felt now had no edge to spend itself against, because the person who had done it was the woman his father woke up beside every morning. Catherine received the news later that afternoon in a quiet family room. She sat with her hands in her lap, listening without interruption as her husband described the restrictions, the council, and the private notes about their eldest son. She did not react at first. She had learned, as he had, how to keep her face a mask while the world turned over. But when he spoke George's name and read the specific role proposed for him, her expression changed. It did not break, it hardened. She rose and crossed to the window. Outside, on the lawn below, the three children were at play in the last of the light, small and bright against the grass, unaware of the machinery moving against them. She stood with her arms folded and said one thing in a voice that left no room for discussion. George, Charlotte, and Louis were to be kept away from every part of this. Their names were not to be spoken in any room where the investigation lived. There were notes about Catherine, too. The pages warned that the Princess of Wales might become the dominant figure of the next reign, that her presence beside William could leave others without a place. Her strength had been measured and found too great. She had been catalogued as a threat to be neutralized. William and Catherine now knew what was planned, but neither yet knew Kiev had started, or what first caused Camilla to believe she had to build it at all. None of them yet understood how long the machine had been running before anyone noticed it moving. The plan did not begin with ambition. It began with a closed door. To understand the folder on the desk, one must look back to a specific morning at Windsor Castle. Charles had authorized a private succession continuity exercise, a high-stakes rehearsal for how the institution would hold itself together in the first uncertain hours after a transfer of power. Camilla had prepared for the briefing, assuming her place as the king's primary support. But moments before the doors were to open, Charles turned to a senior aide and said in a low voice that the room would hold only himself and the Prince of Wales. The instruction was absolute. It meant that the line was being drawn tight, sovereign and heir, and nothing in between. William heard the order and said nothing, recognizing the constitutional logic. But Camilla, arriving moments later, saw the door already shut. Through the thick wood, she could hear the steady rhythm of two men discussing a future she had helped hold together, yet she had been left on the other side. She stood in the long gallery, surrounded by portraits of dead kings and queens who had passed the crown down that same narrow line. She waited one moment longer than dignity required, her hand at her side, her face a mask of stillness. Then she turned and walked away before any staff could witness the silence. That evening, the tension broke behind the doors of their private rooms. There were no advisors present when she asked him why she had been excluded from a conversation about the survival of the monarchy. Charles's answer was even almost clinical. He told her the crown must pass from sovereign to heir directly, without other feelings in the way. He insisted it was constitutional, not personal. Camilla looked at him and did not believe a word of it. To her, it felt like a verdict, a sign that for all her years of service, she was still considered an outsider when the core of the machine moved. She reached up, unfastened the bracelet at her wrist, and set it down on the dressing table. The small, sharp sound of the metal hitting the wood filled the quiet. Charles stood by the door and did not cross the room. The distance between them in that ordinary bedroom was wider than any palace corridor they had ever walked. He said goodnight and left. She sat at the mirror for a long time, watching her own reflection. Within 48 hours, the first internal requests began to circulate. They were not for speeches or schedules, but for emergency access protocols, regency precedents, and the arrangements for a king who could no longer reign. The project was given a title chosen specifically to avoid alarm: continuity planning. 2 words that would pass through any inbox without a second glance. A wound had been named, and the machine had begun to move. But what happened after that meeting changed everything. The fire had burned low in the grate, and no one had come to tend it. Charles and Camilla were alone in the private drawing room, a space usually reserved for quiet evenings, now transformed into a site of psychological reckoning. He did not sit. He stood over the low table where the gray folder lay open, his shadow stretching long against the wall. He looked at the woman he had loved for decades and asked the only question that mattered. Were you preparing for my death, or were you preparing to control what came after me? Camilla was already seated, her spine perfectly straight, not touching the back of the chair. Her hands were folded in her lap, her gaze holding his without flinching. She did not hide behind the palace machinery or offer the polished excuses of a press secretary. She knew the thickness of the file. She knew the inquiry had gone past anything she could explain away as a simple administrative error. Charles pushed the folder 1 inch toward her. She did not touch it. He opened it to the page that restricted William's access to sensitive briefings. Camilla's voice, when it came, was steady. She said that William's long distrust of her, the coldness he had never bothered to hide, could break loose at the worst possible hour. She argued that during a transition, the monarchy could not afford to lose. Someone had to prepare for the chaos he refused to name. But Charles turned the page to the section regarding George. His voice did not rise, but the restraint was more chilling than anger. He told her that planning for continuity was one thing, but using his grandson as a symbolic shield was something no fear could excuse. George was a child, not a tool to be used to soften resistance or bypass a father's authority. For the first time, Camilla's composure showed a fracture. Her hand rose halfway toward the folder, as if to gather the pages back, before returning to the arm of the chair. She admitted the files were built under her authority, but she claimed the sharpest language, the passages describing William as unstable, had been written by men who feared they would be swept out the moment the crown changed hands. She had let their fear write, and she had not struck it out. Then she told him the last thing, the thing that turned the room cold. One complete copy of the plan had already left her household. It had been sent to someone outside, someone with the standing to act on its proposals. The confrontation had laid her fear bare, but it had solved nothing. The danger was no longer inside the house. It was somewhere beyond the walls, in hands neither of them could see. The only questions left were whose hands and how much had already been set in motion while they argued. As the sun rose over the palace, the nature of the crisis shifted. What had begun as a fracture in a marriage was now revealing itself as a rot within the institution. William, working late in his own study, began to go back through the gray folder with a colder eye. He was no longer looking for his stepmother's handwriting or his father's medical updates. He was looking for the architects. He noticed a pattern that chilled him. Across nearly every major proposal, the same set of initials returned. One advisor had been present at the beginning and the end, in the initial structure and in the final margins. When the investigators pulled the original timestamps for the records requests, the truth became even more unsettling. The plan had not begun after the closed door at Windsor or as a response to a single emotional wound. It had started months earlier, during a season when the corridors were supposedly calm. The ambition was not a sudden reaction. It was a long, patient construction. Charles identified the specific level of clearance required to assemble these files without triggering a single internal alarm. To obtain medical schedules, confidential security arrangements, and restricted constitutional briefings required access held only by a small circle at the very top of the household. The king understood finally that people sworn to his service had looked at the coming reign and seen not a private grief to be shielded, but an opening to be used. They had each looked at the transition and seen their own influence potentially flicker out, and they had moved to protect themselves. An emergency council was called in a long room where the air felt thin. Charles laid a marked page in front of the senior private secretary and asked why George's ceremonial schedule had been circulated for review without any parental approval. The official hesitated for several seconds, and in that silence, the room seemed to shrink. The hesitation was its own confession. The official finally admitted that the schedule had been shared during planning discussions led by the Queen's advisors. They had framed the child's role as a way to reassure the public, but William, listening, saw straight through the language. His son had been turned into a tool, a symbolic shield designed to make the entire arrangement feel too tender for anyone to challenge. The outside copy was eventually traced to a high-level constitutional consultant. The drafted language was clever. It never once used the word power. Instead, it spoke of service, continuity, and national steadiness. It was a plan to ensure that Camilla's influence would be seen as a duty rather than a command. Her hand on the transition was being dressed up as an act of sacrifice. Late that night, William sat alone with a handwritten list of names. He worked through them slowly, a pen turning in his fingers. 2 names stopped his hand, people he had trusted through the worst of his family's crises. They had stood near him when he had few others, yet both had sat in the private meetings tied to this plan. It was not the planning itself that frightened him, but the work of presenting him as a man who needed watching. Charles ordered the files seized and the access frozen. He moved to dismantle the network in a single stroke. But the machinery of the palace is not easily stopped once it has been set in motion. Before the last instruction could be carried out, the shape of the investigation had already reached the press. The secret was no longer theirs to keep. The room Charles chose for their final meeting was the least ceremonial space in any house the family kept. It was small and warm, filled with the ordinary artifacts of a long life together, silver-framed photographs, and a dog's basket in the corner. There was no desk to sit behind, only 2 chairs drawn close as the garden outside turned amber in the fading light. Charles placed the final summary of the investigation on the table. He waited for her to sit. When Camilla entered, she carried the same unhurried composure she had used to walk every palace corridor for 20 years. But as she sat, Charles noticed a brittleness he had never seen before. She did not fold her hands in her lap. She rested them flat on her knees, and he saw a small, persistent unsteadiness in her fingers. He told her plainly that he would guard her dignity until the end of his life, but that he would never allow her to manage the crown for even 1 hour beyond his reign. She did not argue. Instead, she offered the truth in the low voice of someone who had finally run out of defenses. She admitted that the closed door at Windsor Castle months earlier had awakened the oldest fear she carried, the terror that once Charles was gone, she would be unwanted, unguarded, and erased from the family she had spent decades holding up. That fear, she said, had pushed her to build a fortress of safety where she should have been able to trust. Charles listened, but his voice remained firm. He told her that while fear explained her actions, it could not excuse them. Trust might return, he said, but only if she released every hand she had placed on the succession. The terms were absolute. Her private circle of advisors would be disbanded immediately, and all access to constitutional planning was revoked. Most importantly, William and Catherine would now hold total control over every preparation that touched George, Charlotte, and Louis. Camilla accepted the terms without a word of protest. Charles saw in her eyes that this was not a surrender of ambition, but the quiet collapse of exhaustion. Late that same night, Catherine found William awake long after midnight. He sat in the low light of a single lamp, his tie loosened, and a cup of tea gone cold at his elbow. He confessed, the one thought he could not share with the investigators. He no longer knew if protecting his father meant defending him from Camilla's influence or saving him from the wreckage he might make of his own marriage. He was caught between the need for justice and the fear of breaking his father's heart. Catherine sat near him and offered the only wisdom that could navigate such a ruin. She told him that mercy without limits would only invite the same danger back through the door, but punishment without mercy might finish Charles altogether. Somewhere between those 2 points, she said, was the only path that did not end in the destruction of the house. The terms had been set, but one final private conversation between a father and his son still waited in the shadows. The news did not break with a roar, but with a steady, unrelenting pulse that touched every corner of the world within seconds. When the official palace statement was released, it was short and surgically precise, confirming that unauthorized succession materials had been discovered and subsequently canceled. But the public did not need a full confession to understand the depth of the fracture. Across every television screen and digital feed, the name Camilla was suddenly tethered to the word succession, and the world began to dissect the ruins of a trust that had taken decades to build. The range of public reaction was immediate and polarized. In the streets of London and across the digital landscape, some defended the Queen, seeing her as a woman who had spent 20 years earning a place she was never formally promised, driven by a desperate need for security. Others, however, read the leaked details with a colder perspective. They saw evidence of unchecked ambition, a quiet, calculated attempt to reshape the future of the monarchy from within its most private rooms. Constitutional experts weighed in on every news cycle, noting how the drafted language had cleverly attempted to frame control as service and authority, as a national duty, the story quickly crossed borders, reaching European royal watchers and American broadcasters, each bringing its own framing to the crisis. In some quarters, the debate pulled at the family's older, unhealed wounds. Commentators began to ask whether this new fracture was truly a surprise, or if it was merely the latest chapter in a history of silence and suspicion that had once driven others away. Then came the moment that did more than any headline could. A public engagement, already on the calendar for weeks, provided the first visual answer to the crisis. As the cars pulled up to the curb, the cameras focused on a single door. King Charles stepped out first, looking weathered but resolute. A beat later, Prince William followed. In a move that broke with standard protocol, William did not maintain the usual distance. Instead, he moved immediately to his father's shoulder. He stayed there throughout the afternoon, his presence a silent but unmistakable declaration of unity. The crowd saw a father and son carrying out their duties as they always had, but anyone who had been following the news understood the choreography. It was a visual shield. By standing together, they were telling the nation that the line of succession remained whole and that the lawful heir was exactly where he belonged. Camilla's absence from the engagement was the final, stinging detail. The family had made its decision, and she was no longer part of the image they showed to the world. The cameras had captured their story, and the public had reached its verdict. But the noise of the world could not reach the quiet room where the final reckoning still waited. The two men had appeared together in the light of the flashbulbs, but they had not yet spoken the words that only a father and a son can say when the doors are finally closed. The symbolic handshake was a beginning, but the hardest truth was still waiting to be told in the shadows of Clarence House. One final meeting remained, and what happened after that moment changed everything. Charles chose the room at Clarence House with deliberate care. It was not a throne room or a formal study, but the smallest, least ceremonial space in the house. It was a home before it was ever a seat of command, and he did not want the weight of the crown in the room with them. There were no aides, no briefing notes, and no prepared statements. There were only two chairs drawn close together, and a garden outside going amber in the final rays of the afternoon. William arrived expecting the hard instructions of his sovereign. Instead, he found a folded note in his father's hand that asked him simply to speak freely. For several minutes, neither man said anything. There were two men who had been trained from birth to face every national crisis in front of a global audience, yet they had never been taught how to admit fear to each other. The silence between them felt like a physical weight. Charles was the one to break it first. He admitted that he had avoided the succession talks for months because to plan for his own incapacity felt like watching his family rehearse a life without him. He confessed that every drill and every emergency protocol had sounded underneath the professional language like a slow goodbye. He had been so focused on the ending that he had failed to see the suspicion and the fear growing in the shadows of his own house. William listened without moving, but then he offered his own confession, which was no easier to speak. He admitted that his guarded coldness toward Camilla over the years, the distance he had maintained as a shield for his mother's memory, had helped create the very fear that drove her to build protection for herself. He told his father that while the files were inexcusable, his own silence had helped teach her that she would need to defend her place once the crown moved on. As they talked, the light in the garden shifted from amber to gray. Neither man moved to turn on a lamp. They sat in the gathering dark like two people who had forgotten the time, and for once, the forgetting was a kind of peace. Charles reached across the small table and laid his hand flat over the note. He told his son that protecting Camilla could never mean weakening William, and it could never, under any circumstance, mean reaching for George. The boy was not a symbol to be spent, and the heir around a child was not territory to be held. That line, he said, would never move again. He offered William every transition document, nothing withheld, and asked him to lead the building of a new succession framework in the full light of day. William agreed, but set a single condition that was both firm and merciful. Camilla would keep her dignity, her security, and her respect. She would remain the king's wife, but she would hold no independent power over the passing of the crown. Charles accepted the terms without a word of argument. They did not call it forgiveness. William called it a boundary one that protected his father, secured his own future, and put his son beyond the reach of anyone's private strategy. The agreement was reached, and the line was drawn. What remained was the quietest moment of all. Late that night, Charles climbed the stairs alone to the top of the house. He had not been there in some time. He went now. King Charles climbed the stairs alone as the house settled into the silence of midnight. He did not often visit the top of the house anymore, but tonight, the weight of the crown felt lighter than the weight of the day. The corridor here was narrow and low, lined with the forgotten objects of a childhood that was moving much too fast. He saw a coat that was now several sizes too small for anyone in the house and a pair of boots left by a door. At the very end of the hall, a single lamp had been left burning low. Through the open nursery door, he saw a small table set for 3. It was George's place, kept ready for a morning that would arrive without any memory of the folders or the crises that had filled the week. The chair was small, the cup and plate were simple, and everything was exactly as it should be for a child. Charles stood in the doorway for a long time. He did not go in. He only watched the quiet room and felt the exhale that comes after a long season of held breath. The cost of the last several months was finally clear. Charles had kept his monarchy whole, but he had lost a measure of trust in his marriage that he might never fully recover. Camilla remained at his side, her title and her dignity protected, but her private circle was gone, and her influence over the future had been permanently severed. She would be the king's wife, but she would never be the director of the reign to come. William had gained the security of his future, but he carried the stinging knowledge that those he trusted had measured him as a danger. He had discovered that his own long silence had helped write the fear that built the plan. Catherine, too, had seen her strength catalogued as a threat, and in response, she had drawn a line around her children that no palace official would ever be permitted to cross again. And then there was George. The boy knew nothing of the gray folder, the amber light in the garden, or the long silences in which his grandfather had decided his fate. The files were now sealed, the network of advisors was pulled apart, and the line of succession ran clear once more from Charles to William, and in time, to George. The institution had come to the edge of a precipice, not because of an outside enemy, but because of private fears hidden inside the mask of loyalty. It had survived because the truth was finally spoken aloud and a limit was finally set. Charles reached into the room and turned the small lamp down until the shadows took the walls. He drew the door closed without a sound, the way a man closes a door on a sleeping child. He went back down the stairs alone, past the portraits of kings who had faced their own betrayals and the shut rooms where the history of a nation was kept. He returned to the parts of the house where the crown waited for him, and always would. The chair would wait too, and the boy would come to it in his own time, knowing nothing yet of the folder, the lamp, or the long silence in which his grandfather had decided that some inheritances are worth more than any crown,